We're going to be continuing our series this week of the questions you hope no one asks. Last week, we studied where evidence meets faith and how faith must be a part of the equation. We talked about sitting in a chair, how we give our trust and our faith to things that oftentimes we don't even think about. So how can we logically know that a God has to exist? We looked at different arguments. Though I don't want you to argue with your friend, I want you to have discussions with your friends about the existence of God. Well, one of the biggest kickbacks to those arguments is what we're looking at today, the problem of evil. I have a friend who went through a lot of hardships. He got a text one day that said that all of his oxen had been killed and all of his donkeys had been killed. And only the person who sent him the text to let him know that they had been stolen was the one that survived that was in the field. Then, as soon as that text message hit his phone, he got another text that said all of his sheep had been destroyed by fire, that lightning had struck a field. What are the odds, right? And as soon as that text hit his phone, he got another text that said that all of his camels that were out in the field and the servants that were with him had been taken captive. They had been stolen. So there we have it. This friend of mine, he had his oxen and his donkeys stolen. He had his sheep lit up by fire. He had his camels stolen from him. And if that wasn't enough bad luck and evil in his life for one day, he got a text that no parent ever wishes to get. He got a text that said his children were together eating a meal in one of their homes. And a bad storm came through, and a tornado, a great wind, knocked down the corners of the home and killed them all. So in a day, in just a few short moments, everything this man had was taken away. And then over the next week, his health began to deteriorate, and he began to get these big, painful boils on his skin. He was left sitting in ashes, weeping and mourning. And he asked those that showed up to comfort him what was going on. How would you respond to my friend? You probably know my friend by the name of Job. Job's a man who seemed like he was dealt a very difficult hand. And the entire book of Job helps us a little bit try to create a theodicy in what we're going to talk about tonight, to understand and wrestle with the problem of evil. But I want to give this warning first. Whenever we have friends who are struggling with the existence of God because they don't just know evil is real because of other people around them, but because they've experienced it for themselves and the hardships in life, the ups and the downs, this is not necessarily the time whenever you go to comfort them to start talking about a theodicy or how we make sense of evil existing in the world in the presence of a good, all-powerful, all-knowing God. What is more appropriate is what happens with Job's friends there for just a few verses in Job 2. Whenever Job's friends, rather than starting to try to solve his problems and make sense of why he's suffering, just sit there for 7 days and say nothing at all. They're present. They weep. They mourn with him. That's our challenge as God's people, is to prove the existence of God, not just by a logical basis, but by compassionate hearts that come from our Savior. So as we're thinking about these logical ways that we could defend the faith, or we could have conversations with people, or that we ourselves can enrich our faith by having full confidence in the existence of God, in the presence of evil and tragedy in the world, we need to remember that people who don't necessarily fully know God and are convicted of Him don't need a lecture in that moment. They need to sense the presence of God through your presence. So start there. But there will hopefully be a time when a conversation can arise and say, how can this be? How can an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God allow evil to exist? Because evil's real. Just a few weeks ago, on December 10th, there were tornadoes that wreaked havoc all across the states. From those tornadoes, there were 90 fatalities. Evil's real. There were homes lost, lives destroyed. People will now set their dates pre-tornado, post-tornado because of one event in their life. How do they respond to that evil? What about COVID, right? What about COVID-19? Unfortunately, worldwide, there's been 5.55 million pass away because of COVID. How does this evil, how can a good God allow this evil to continue on? Let's get more specific. In Memphis, Tennessee alone, there were 342 reported homicides last year. That's unreal. That amount of evil in one place. Evil is real. And I'm sure you can think a lot of other things that would fall in the category of evil. What about whenever a family member is diagnosed with cancer, or a teenager dies in a car wreck, or what about a baby that's stillborn? Evil's real. I know that. But I also know that God is real, because we talked about that last week. So here's this tension between these two, that evil is real and God is real, but there's a fundamental principle about who God is that something does not add up. And that's where theodicy comes in, as we try to figure out how to make sense of the presence of evil and the presence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God. The problem of evil is classically posed by J.L. Mackie and Anthony Flew and others. And this is the classical argument for it. One, God is omnipotent. God is omniscient. And God is omni-benevolent. Those three things mean that God is infinite in His power, that God is infinite in His knowledge, and that God is infinite in His goodness. But the fourth proposal is that evil exists, and that one there's no getting around. So what the problem of evil proposes is that God cannot be all three while evil exists. Because an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God would not allow evil to exist. So, therefore, He must be all-powerful and all-knowing, but not all-good, because He does allow evil to exist. Or God must be all-knowing and infinitely good, but not powerful enough to remove evil from the world. Or He must be all-powerful and all-good, but not have the knowledge to know how to remove evil from the world. That's what the argument from the other side says. That God cannot be all three, but must be only two of these if evil does exist. And that's where theodicy comes in. Whenever we think of theodicy, that is simply understanding the presence of evil in the face of three areas. How do I understand evil and its presence in the world concerning God, concerning humankind, and concerning the world? And concerning evil, that's another one that we'll talk about, is how do I understand evil and the presence of God in the face of these things? What do I believe about God? What do I believe about humans? And what do I believe about the world? So let's dive in. The first thing concerning God, we need to understand that the Bible affirms, holds up as true, that God is omnipotent, that He is all-powerful, that there's nothing that God cannot do. Now, I want to pause, because whenever I say that, I want to make sure we understand what I mean here. Because in Mark 10, verse 27, Jesus speaking says, "With man it is impossible, but with God all things are possible." What does Jesus mean by all things? We must logically think about this, is because maybe you've heard the question before, can God create a rock so big that He cannot lift it? See, that question puts God in a box that He does not belong, because creating a rock that is so big that God cannot lift it logically does not lend itself to being done. Only those things that are possible to be done can be accomplished. God is powerful enough to accomplish those things. For example, the Bible also tells us God cannot lie. So is He not powerful enough to lie? No, it is impossible for Him to lie, simply from the fact that the Bible tells us so, but also because of His righteousness. So whenever we think about God being all-powerful, we must remind ourselves that it also has to be true that God is all-powerful to do those things that lend themselves to being done. Now, that will be important as we start talking about here in a minute the presence of evil and man's responsibility, humankind's responsibility in evil in the world and the consequences that come from that is that God is powerful, all-powerful, to do those things that lend themselves to being done. There's one more thing, and this is something that really helped me, and it also helps us with all of the omnis. Omnipresence, his omniscience, his omnipotence, his omni-benevolence, is that just because we say God is all-powerful, it doesn't mean that he always has to be all-powerful. All-powerful means that he has all control over his power, or his omniscience, him being all-knowing, means he has all control over how much he knows or how little he knows. I think about Jesus. We'll go ahead to this next thing. God is omniscient. I think about Jesus in Philippians 2 whenever Paul writes about how Christ emptied himself. The whole point being made there is that God is still omniscient, but he chose to know less for our benefit. He became like a man. He gave up some of those things that he enjoyed with the Father in heaven. So whenever we think of God's power and his knowledge and his goodness and his presence, that doesn't just mean that he has no control over how much, like he can't control himself. I think about the fruits of the Spirit, the last one that oftentimes is overlooked is self-control. One of God's fundamental characteristics is control, self-control. So he can control how much he can do and how little he knows or how much he knows. So he has full control. God is all powerful to do those things which lend themselves to being done. He also, is all knowing. I think about Psalm 147 verse 5. Great is our Lord and abundant in power. His understanding is beyond measure. So does God know how to remove evil? Yes. But here's the thing. Is removing evil affects other things God has set up. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. As we think about this and removing evil and God's knowledge, we have to understand his will. What is God's will for humankind? Is he not all-knowing? Does he not know how to remove sin? I just said that he does know how to remove sin, and it's his will that allows us to see that. There's three parts of God's will. The first part of his will is his ideal will. We see in 2 Peter 3 and 9 and 1 Timothy 3 and verse 7 that God desires all people, all from everywhere, from all races and all ethnicities and all backgrounds, to come to salvation through Jesus Christ. That is God's ideal will, is that no one would perish, but all would come to salvation. So you think about that person who you really want to bring to Christ, that you want them to be in a saved relationship with Jesus. So does God. That's his ideal will. So thinking about removing sin and removing evil and removing hardships, God's ideal will is that they would live in a place in eternity where evil no longer exists. But that's not the reality, is it? Because we know that humans can break God's ideal will. You know somebody that has chosen to not follow Jesus, to not give their life to God. Therefore, we have God's circumstantial will. This is the will of what God has planned to do and has done through Jesus. So God knows that humans sinned and would sin, because Ephesians tells us before the foundations of the world, God had the plan to send Jesus. We also see as soon as Adam and Eve had sinned in Genesis 3, that God had intended that a Messiah would come and that he would crush the head of the serpent and the serpent would bruise his heel. Genesis 3 and verse 15. So can man break God's circumstantial will that he sinned, man sinned, God sent Jesus, but not everybody will obey the life and the work of Jesus. But that's God's circumstantial will. Finally, the ultimate will of God, that which no one can break, that all people will be subject to, is in eternity whenever he returns again. I'm mindful of Matthew 25:31 through 46, when Jesus separates the goat from the sheep. All people will be called into an account, to give an account for what they've done in their life before the Lord. That's his ultimate will. So, is God all-knowing? Yes. But here's the part, is that he's given man free will. And we'll talk about this when we talk about man. So therefore, because he's given man free will, he knew that man would not always uphold his will. He's made ways, in which man can follow God despite sin in his life and evil in his life. So the last thing that we see is that God is omni-benevolent, that God is all good. So if God is omnipotent, God is omniscient, and God is omni-benevolent, what does that mean? Psalm 27, verse 13, the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God of mercy and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Do you believe that God is all good? I do. I believe my God is good, and James tells us, James 1 and verse 17, that every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no shadow or change. God is good. God is all-powerful. God is all-knowing. Therefore, what do we understand about ourselves? So as we think about our theodicy, I uphold the truths of the Bible, that God is all-powerful, God is all-knowing, God is all-good. Therefore, something must be different about me. If that is true about God, it must not be God's direct responsibility that evil exists, and that evil is affecting our world in the ways that skeptics would want to accuse him of. Well, it comes down to my presence in it. Am I a free will being, or is there determinism in the world? Free will means I have the ability to make my own choices. I think about how the Bible affirms this in Joshua 24 and verse 17, as Joshua is challenging Israel. He says that today you must decide for yourselves and for your house who you will follow. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. So there's a choice there. Will I serve God? Will I not serve God? In the garden in Genesis 1, we see that there's a choice. Will I obey God? Will I not obey God? And we know, unfortunately, that people have free will in a way that they disobey God sometimes. And this is the other point that I want to point out, is the Bible also affirms the truth that God is love. That God is love. 1 John 4 and verse 7 says that God is love. If God is love and he does not give us free will, he is not love. I want you to think about somebody who says they love you, maybe like your parents. And let's say they force you to do something that's dangerous for you, or they force some evil upon you. You have no choice in it. But they say they love you. Do they really love you? I'm not saying like they force you to eat your green beans and force you to eat your vegetables because those things are actually good for you. I'm saying like they put you in a dangerous situation. They drink and they drive with you in the car. They make poor decisions that affect your well-being. Maybe it's a friend, maybe it's somebody you respect dearly, but they say they love you but continually put you in harmful situations. At some point, you're going to start questioning their love. Well, if God is love and he does not give us a choice to help and aid our own health, right? Please stick with me here. It is not love at all, and God is not who he says he is. But because God gives us a choice and he is love, he gives us the choice to love him back, to love him as he has loved us. Determinism would be the other end. It would mean that everything you do is not your own choice, but God has predetermined it, that it was God who decided that for your life. Therefore, if that is the case, it would be God who is directly responsible for every evil, whether intrinsic or instrumental, that happens in your life. If a tornado hits your life, that's because of God. If somebody dies in your life, that's because of God. If somebody sins or has an affair or has cheats or does whatever, some sin, is angry and goes into a place of worship or into school, that's because God determined that for that person's life. But that's not the case, because what does the Bible affirm? That we have free will, and each person is responsible before God for their destiny. So we understand that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all good. We understand that man has a free will choice. But what about evil? there's two kinds of evil that we need to talk about. The first is intrinsic evil. These are things that are evil within and of themselves. That it is a direct attack on the nature of God. It is said that intrinsic evils are those things that contradict and hurt sonship with God and brotherhood with man. That's from Thomas B. Warren's Have Atheists Proved There Is No God? What Thomas B. Warren is trying to say there is only those things that harm your relationship between God, sin, and your relationship through Jesus with a fellow man, that is evil in and of itself. Those things are those that we find listed in the Bible, like anger, sinning with anger, right? You can be angry and sin not, the Bible tells us that. Or drunkenness, or adultery, or lust. We can go on and down and down and down, those things that harm this relationship between God and between each other. And sin is the only evil that is truly evil in and of itself. The other evil that oftentimes we think about are instrumental evils. Those things that in and of themselves are not evil. I want you to think about a tornado. A tornado is not evil. It's part of a natural cycle, a natural weather atmosphere working of how God set up the universe. They are going to happen. What about the tornado that hits the farm out in Kansas? And it doesn't destroy anything. It just hits a field where no one lives. Is that tornado evil? Do you hear about it on ABC News at night? No, it's not. It's not until that tornado happens to hit a town that homes are destroyed and lives are destroyed and people die that it becomes evil. The tornado in and of itself is not evil, but how people respond and perceive it to be. You see, there's things that are instrumentally evil. They have the potential to be evil or to be used for good, depending on how people respond to them. So this leads us to a conclusion. If we think about the problem of evil and the presence of God and the presence of evil in our world, what is the world set up to be? Why did God create the world? Maybe that's something you can talk about in your Oasis groups. Why do you think God created the world? Not just humans, but the world. You see, the Bible affirms and speaks to this often, is that the world was set up to develop spiritual and moral maturity. That the world is the perfect atmosphere and the perfect setting in which people can grow spiritually and morally. That there's difficulties and there's trials and there's challenges in their life to push them to pursue a relationship with God. So why do instrumental evils exist? Why are they instrumental evils? It's so that we, through those hardships, can draw closer to God. John Hick, in Philosophy of Religion, says this: Christianity, however, has never supposed that God's purpose in the creation of the world was to construct a paradise whose inhabitants would experience a maximum of pleasure and a hedonistic paradise, or a self-centered, self-indulging paradise. But the Bible makes it clear that this world was made to be inhabited by people that they may be spiritually and morally mature. What John Hick is trying to say is the reason that there's this tension and that we need to create a theodicy between the presence of God, that God is real, and the presence of evil. That tension comes into play whenever people who do not have a Christian worldview believe that the maximum of life, the highest of mankind's experience, humankind's experience, is self-fulfillment, is for the pleasures of oneself, rather than seeing the spiritual and moral maturity that the world brings us into. So if we understand that from a Christian viewpoint, right, that this world is designed in such a way to bring us to spiritual and moral maturity, it makes perfect sense why there's intrinsic and instrumental evils in the world. It's not because God isn't all powerful and He's not all knowing and He's not all good. It's because God has set up a world in which we have a choice to love Him back. And we have a choice to grow closer to Him in faith. Tonight, I hope that you've been challenged. I hope that you've learned something. And maybe you have questions. That's okay. Please tell those to your leaders. And leaders, please write those down as next week we learn from Q&A, from things that you have and your questions that you've been thinking through these past 2 weeks. I'm excited to study next week, and I'm thankful that you've studied with us tonight. At this time, we'll go into our Oasis groups. Thanks for being here. I look forward to seeing you on Sunday and next Wednesday as well.